Well, welcome again to Earlswood Baptist Church House Group. This week we're going to look at the second half of Mark chapter 5 and at two healings. Again, these are very familiar stories, and Mark really quite likes to sort of intertwine stories. So he's telling part of one and then moves on to something else and then moves back to the original story. So here we have the lady with her chronic bleeding and Jairus' daughter. The reading is Mark chapter 5 verses 21 to 43, and as you listen to it, you might like to think of how these are stories, very similar stories in some ways, of how people are taken from fear to faith.
When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed round him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
As we said, in these stories, there's movement from faith to fear. And there are also questions that we might ask ourselves. Why is this lady healed? Yet many in Israel weren't healed when Jesus was around. Why is this girl raised? But most aren't. There are just a few stories in the Gospels of people who are raised from the dead. And we need to remind ourselves that Jesus wasn't coming to be a one-man liberation movement. He wasn't coming to free Israel from the Roman domination. He wasn't coming to be a one-man medical center either, to bring healing and wholeness and nothing else. These events were signs. They were signs looking forward to the real and permanent healing that was going to come through Jesus' death and resurrection, a healing from separation from God and a healing from sin and death in that sense. So we come to the lady with a bleeding problem. And I think in these stories, so often it's the details that might stand out to us. And it's those details that perhaps remind us that these are eyewitness accounts, the little odds and ends that all the gospel writers throw in that seem to have come from people who were there at the time. I've always loved the way that Mark mentions how she spent all her monies on doctors, whereas Luke the doctor doesn't mention that bit. I suspect too we might have difficulty getting our heads around what being permanently unclean would mean. Can you think of any 2021 equivalent? Because this lady would have been totally shunned from society and cut off from society with her problem. And then we might ask the question, why was she healed by faith? Just by faith or just by Jesus' power? The power comes from Jesus, but he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. So I think it's Jesus' power that takes us from fear and illness into faith and wholeness. There's a bit of us involved and a lot of Jesus. When we come to the daughter, just like the lady, Jairus also loses his dignity to fall at Jesus' feet. Probably well-known local leader like that, it wouldn't have looked too good the next Sabbath when he was leading the meeting in the synagogue. And we might ask ourselves, do we often prefer our dignity to our faith in Jesus? And poor man, what must it have been like for him to wait while Jesus dealt with the lady? He must have been jumping from one foot to the other, thinking, my daughter's dying. Can't you get a move on? And when they get to the house, there's a question of power or faith again. Jesus only goes into the apparently dead girl with his closest disciples, the ones who, for all their failings, perhaps believe in him the most, and he throws out all the mourners who are insisting that she's dead. It seems like an atmosphere of faith is what allows Jesus to heal, and I think that's a lesson that we should take, that when we're looking to pray for people, or even when just looking for things to happen in the church, an atmosphere of faith of people who believe really helps Jesus to work through us. And of course, Jesus is just so practical. Give us something to eat. He's not super spiritual when it comes down to it. He cares for the girl at all levels. So some simple thoughts for today, which we might start our discussion and for you to think about at home. Do we live in a state of fear or a state of faith? Possibly a very good question in these COVID days. Do we sometimes need that faith to reach out and touch Jesus, for us to do something that our faith might develop more? And when we're around people, do we create an atmosphere of faith? Or maybe, unfortunately, do we create an atmosphere of fear? Some things to think about there.